Oppenheimer has been out for over 2 weeks now, and the film continues to be praised and cross box office milestones nearly every day. It hit $500 million yesterday, and it's clear that Nolan has had a big win with his first film under Universal Pictures. But looking ahead, it does make me wonder what type of film we could see from him, and whether he'll continue to put his stamp on a film within a different genre. There's obviously many different approaches which the director could take, but it's interesting nonetheless to try and put our finger on what route he will take. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the genres of film that Christopher Nolan could tackle next following the release of Oppenheimer. Before I get into it though, if you want to see more content on the director, his recent film, and eventual future projects, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's dive into what Christopher Nolan's next film could be. Starting with the genre which Nolan has talked about multiple times in the past, the horror film is one that I think many Nolan fans, including myself, really want to see from the director. It's a genre which Nolan has used aesthetically and tonally in various scenes within his previous films, and no more evident than as seen in Oppenheimer with the horrifying victory speech scene. If that wasn't a great indicator of how well Nolan could do with a horror film, then I don't know what is. He has mentioned previously that he'd like to approach horror, especially in his book by Tom Schoen, which was released a few years ago, titled The Nolan Variations, and the more I think about it, the more I think he's the perfect fit for a full-out psychological horror film. And knowing him, it could even be based on something that many people around the world would relate to, or something that actually happened. I would like to see how Nolan would integrate his ever-changing use of time, his reoccurring use of thematics like guilt, personal identity, or the subjective experience into an epic yet emotional horror story. It could be interesting to see something in the vein of, say, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, but more in the style of a Christopher Nolan movie, with, say, the hint of something like The Truman Show. But if not a horror film, what I could see us getting is some sort of story in the mold of the mystery genre, one that has elements of horror or even sci-fi infused into it. Years ago, he mentioned about reimagining the 1967 TV show The Prisoner, which follows a British intelligence agent who's been abducted, taken to a strange coastal village, and anyone who tries to escape is recaptured or killed. He was asked about this on the Happy Sad Confused podcast a week or so ago, and said in reply, "I wouldn't want to say anything about what I'm gonna do next, because the truth is, I haven't figured it out." So who knows what idea is on his mind, but with The Prisoner being brought back up in conversation, I would definitely love to see his approach on something like a mystery, or going full on into the horror genre. We've seen great flashes of those genres throughout his other films, and I think it would make sense to see him go fully down that path at some point in his career. So yes, my first prediction would be either a mystery movie or a psychological horror tale that has an element of his approach to realism. Moving on, my next prediction would be for Nolan to approach either another biopic or an original film. Oppenheimer has so far been a huge success, and while it is a biopic thriller, it's no secret that Christopher Nolan has wanted to make a biopic for quite some time, way before the release of his latest project. Years and years ago, Nolan was originally going to do a Howard Hughes biopic, and he famously called the script one of the best he ever wrote. At the time, Martin Scorsese had made The Aviator, and that idea was put to one side. But who's to say he doesn't pick that idea back up, or because of Oppenheimer's success, does a different biopic in the future? Now, this isn't one of my strongest predictions, because traditionally, Nolan does turn to a different genre with every film he makes, and I'd think it would be unlikely that he'd make another biopic straight after doing Oppenheimer. But still, with it being successful and that previously mentioned Howard Hughes film being one that he wanted to make, there's still a chance we might see another down the line. While I see this as being unlikely, one thing I could see him doing, however, is another original film like Memento, Inception, Interstellar, or Tenet. If we look at his filmography, he traditionally does one film that is based on a franchise, historical event, or book, and then follows it up with an original film. So there's a good chance that he might do the same following Oppenheimer, turning to another mind-bending original idea that reflects the world we live in today. After all, in many recent interviews, he's been discussing the consequences of AI in relation to the story of Oppenheimer. And with discussions about AI being in the news today and technology being highly prominent in Nolan's entire filmography, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw an original film tackling artificial intelligence head on. So at this point in the video, my top 4 predictions would be at number 1, a horror film, at number 2, a mystery, at number 3, another original project, and number 4, another biopic. The last 2 choices I have are ones that are probably the least likely on my list, but are still routes that I could see him taking. The first of which is an epic western film. Now, Nolan's brother Jonathan Nolan has touched on the western genre in his sci-fi show Westworld, and Chris himself had elements of a western in the design and look of Oppenheimer with what we saw of Los Alamos. But to go full western and take on a genre of a much earlier time period would be quite an interesting and bold choice for him. It could fittingly reflect Nolan's style of combining old and modern filmic techniques, aiming to freshen up a genre of the past. Again, I think this is unlikely, but Nolan is known to take directions with each of his films that are quite unexpected. So I do think there is a small chance of a western being his next project. If he was to do a western, I would love to see something like Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian adapted, as it's a great story that would reflect the horrors of history, like with how that book references humans constantly waging war in an endless cycle. That book was by the same author as No Country for Old Men, one of my favourite film adaptations ever, and while the studio is currently adapting it, in the past, they've tried many times and the project has either not materialised or has eventually been shelved. So if it did get shelved again, a director I would love to see tackle the unfilmable is Christopher Nolan. It's a brilliant story that focused on a character called the Kid being pursued across the American Southwest and northern Mexico by a murderous group of scalp hunters led by a menacing character called the Judge. Think of Darth Vader, but way more brutal and as a Western character. But yeah, something like that would be really cool to see, and especially if it's a Western story that integrates the director's filmmaking trademarks. And coming to my last prediction, this is the one that is probably the most unlikely of the bunch, but is still something that I think has a small percentage of happening in the long run. And that is, of course, a Christopher Nolan James Bond movie. Now, I did a video on this topic a few weeks ago, talking about how I think that if Nolan is going to do a Bond film, now is the time for him to do it. As for one, Bond is essentially starting over, and 2, Nolan would be a lot older by the time something like this came around again. However, since making that video, Nolan was asked in an interview about it and said that there would need to be a real incentive for him to do it and that he would need to have full control over the production process. He also said that it's obvious how influential the Bond films have been on his own work, and he would of course love to do it if he had that creative control. So really, it all comes down to timing, what the producers of Bond want from the next iteration, and whether they would let Nolan fully do what he wanted with it. One thing I will say is that Nolan could be acting secretive with his recent comments, as he does like to keep things close to the chest, and with a James Bond film, that is also the case until big announcements are made. So yes, I am holding out hope for a Nolan Bond film at some point, but as suggested, it does look quite unlikely at this particular time. Overall, whatever Nolan does take on next, I trust that he'll do something great, both by bringing his auteur style to it and by making it interesting and reflective of the time. The Dark Knight released after 9/11 and reflected the fears towards terrorism. Dunkirk came out around Brexit and focused on groups of people coming together to just survive. And Oppenheimer has come out around a time where nuclear fears have been accelerated. So he makes films that feel right for their time, speaking to global audiences in a relatable yet innovative way too. Like I said, my main predictions would be either a horror, a mystery, another original film, or another biopic. And while we'll have to wait a while to see whatever he does do next, I'm sure it'll be worth the wait. Nolan clarified recently that he will not embark on any new filmmaking ventures until the ongoing Hollywood strikes by the Screen Actors Guild and Writers Guild are resolved. But if and when they do, we'll hopefully be getting another brilliant movie from the director. And again, whatever it is, I will be lined up to see it. But that was my video discussing the different possibilities for Christopher Nolan's next film. I am really interested to see what genre of film Nolan tackles after the release of Oppenheimer and how he will put his stamp on it. I'm sure the director will soon be working on an idea for this, and it will be intriguing to see how it all plays out. We'll have to see, and hopefully his next film will release within the next 3 years like it typically does, given the circumstances surrounding the recent strikes. But let me know down below in the comment section what type of film you think Christopher Nolan will approach in the next few years, and whether you like some of my choices in this video. For much more content on Christopher Nolan and his latest film Oppenheimer, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.